It's a pleasure to introduce Dr. Tina Widowski, who took a rather circuitous path from the middle of Chicago to the University of Guelph, where she is currently the director of the Campbell Center for the Study of Animal Welfare. The transition from urbanite to farm animal welfare scientist started when she had to look up the definition of heifer. I am told I can't scientifically document that. And ended or continued on when she worked with Stanley Curtis, the University of Iowa, that's totally wrong, Lena, the University of Illinois, looking at pig behavior and welfare, and then did a postdoc at the University of Wisconsin studying reproductive biology and behavior of endangered monkeys. She also now was given the country's first chair of poultry welfare at the University of Guelph. And one of the things I wanted to stress to the students is that just because you grew up in a city or just because you have no exposure to farm animals doesn't mean you can't be involved in farm animal welfare or veterinary medicine. Dr. Widowski.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Kaiser. Is this the right direction? Is this okay? The acoustics are a little bit different here. How did you know I had to look up heifer in the dictionary?
Oh, I'm very clever.
Today I've been asked to talk about how important normal behavior is for an animal's welfare, and it's really a pleasure to be here and talk to you. And I wanted to get a little bit of a sense of the audience here. How many of you here are students? Okay. I know all those in the back. They're the award winners, right? How many of you are small animal practitioners? Okay. And large animal? Okay. All right. So quite a good mix in here. I've been asked to talk about how important normal behavior is for an animal's behavior, or for an animal's welfare. And there's a number of reasons that we've always been very interested in behavior as a part of animal welfare. And Professor Duncan has mentioned several of those. He started out talking about the naturalists, the first ethologists who studied natural behavior in animals. And there's always been a notion, and I think someone said when they were asked to define animal welfare over there, that part of animal welfare has this idea that animals should be able to lead some degree of natural lives and have be able to perform species-typical behavior patterns in order to have good welfare. Some people have the viewpoint that that's very important for animal welfare. Another reason that we've always studied behavior is for the reasons that Dr. Duncan has pointed out, in that it gives us an insight into the emotional lives of animals, if you would. It allows us to get into their heads and study their subjective states, so we can use their behavior to see how they feel about the things that we do. I'm going to talk about another reason for looking at animal behavior in relation to animal welfare, in that understanding animal behavior is important for actually understanding the entire biology and physiology of the animal, because many behavior patterns are very closely linked with other physiological systems or other biological systems that are very important for keeping the animal healthy and reproductively successful. So for those of us who are involved in livestock, this is very important. It's also important because when things go wrong, they also often result in the development of abnormal behavior, which is not good for the health and well-being of the animal. So my goals for today are to talk a little bit about just basics of how we understand and the ways that we look at understanding the behavioral biology of the animal, and some ideas with how there's all these behaviors that an animal can perform at any given time. How does it actually decide what it does at a given moment? Then I want to talk a little bit about how behavior patterns are closely linked with other biological processes or the physiology of other types of systems. And then I want to look at then how, knowing this, how we understand this, we can see how mismatches between the animal's behavior and the ways in either we house them or manage them can lead to abnormal behavior patterns that cause poor health or injury. It can lead to behavior problems or reduced welfare. So when we think about understanding normal behavior, there's a couple of things that we have to think about. So normal behavior, what is it? I'm thinking of it to some degree as natural behavior, or something that occurs in a natural environment, and then also may or may not occur in some of the more intensive systems in which we keep livestock in now. And in order to understand why an animal does what it does, I think we have to have some understanding of the natural history of the animal. Think back to what it's built for and how it evolved. We have to think about how its behavior might be controlled, either by factors in the outside world or by factors inside the animal's body. And we also have to remember that most of the animals that we're dealing with have been domesticated and have been genetically selected by humans for thousands of years, and that their behavior may or may not have changed because of the process of domestication. So we need to think of all of those things as a bit of background. So when we think about the natural history of the animal, we're thinking about its sensory capacities and sensory systems, and this is important because the different visual systems and auditory systems that animals have allows it to detect and perceive various things in its environment. And I'm sure you'll see later on today, when Temple's talking about auditing, say, in slaughter plants, how important it is to think about what the animal can see, because it sees very differently than us, or may be able to smell and detect things in its environment that we're less sensitive to. So we have to think about that, and this has been shaped by the animal's evolutionary history. We also have to think about what it was built for, or what it was shaped by natural history. Is it limits its adaptations to the environment. Most of the domestic species and livestock species that we're dealing with are pretty adaptable. We can put them in a variety of housing systems, a variety of farm types, and they do readily well. But we have to think about their natural history is going to limit how much they're able to adapt to the environment or management systems that we put them in. We also have to think about the fact that behavior, or many important behavior patterns, and these are the ones that we'll see tend to be highly motivated and very important to the animal, are those that promote survival and reproductive success. And these are ones that are going to be very closely linked to some physiological systems in the animal. And finally, we have to think a little bit about the animal's social organization. The group composition, was it in a small group? Because now generally we're keeping livestock and poultry in very large groups. What is the group size that they're in? The age composition. Most animals, like pigs for example, have a small social group in the wild, a few sows, they're young, and the animals are kept in different ages, they're in mixed sex, and that's not true for a lot of the housing systems that we keep livestock in right now. We've changed our social organization a great deal. So thinking about natural history helps us to remember what the animal may or may not be set up for. And you'll see in some of my examples how this is true. Another thing that we need to think about when looking at behavior and how it fits in and why it's important for animal welfare is the notion of different motivation. Dr. Duncan was talking about asking animals to push through weighted doors to see how important something is to an animal, or measuring the strength of their motivation to do a particular thing at a particular time. So when we think about motivation, it explains why, of all the various things, should it be feeding now, nesting, having sex, foraging, playing, or sleeping, why an animal is choose to do what it's doing when it does it. And usually our systems are set up, or the animal systems are set up, to make sure the animal does the right thing in the right place at the right time in order to promote survival and fitness. So one easy way to look at it, we have so many different behavior patterns, and they're controlled in very, very many different ways. So one way that ethologists have often looked at this is that animals can be controlled either by internal stimuli on the one extreme, or totally by external stimuli on the other. Although we know that probably most behavior patterns are controlled by a little bit of both. But it's important to think about what it is that's controlling it. For example, for internal stimuli, and this is where we get a lot of links to physiological systems, is that in many behavior patterns, like feeding behavior, for example, drinking behavior, or homeostatic behaviors, are going to be controlled to a great degree by cues that are linked to those homeostatic systems. So in the case of feeding, it's going to be blood glucose, other types of hormones or satiety factors. In the case of drinking, there's signals, obviously, that are going to signal the animal to want to drink at certain times. Shade, for example, is going to be related to core body temperature. So many behaviors are controlled by internal stimuli. A lot of behaviors, and particularly reproductive behaviors, like the nesting behavior that Professor Duncan talked about, are controlled by the hormones associated with reproduction. And so a lot of reproductive and maternal behaviors are switched on by physiological changes that set the animal up to behave in a certain way that promotes the survival of offspring. On the other end of the spectrum, we have behavior that is primarily determined by external stimuli. So things like anti-predator behavior, for example, or aggression. These are going to be controlled by who's out there, what they smell like, what they look like, what they sound like. So external stimuli, things in the animal's environment. So behaviors that are primarily controlled by internal factors are going to be things like feeding, drinking, sexual behavior, and reproductive or maternal behavior. And these are many behaviors that are controlled primarily or very heavily controlled by internal stimuli are those that we'll see occur in environments that are completely inappropriate for that behavior to be occurring. So for nesting in hens, for example, and I'll give you another example in a moment, that nesting behavior is occurring in the absence of the appropriate stimuli. It's an important behavior for the animal to have. Other behavior patterns that are more controlled by external stimuli, we may be able to control more by managing the environment of the animal. So for example, if aggressive behavior or anti-predator behavior or social, we can actually manage those sorts of stimuli or those aspects of the environment so the animal is not necessarily motivated to engage in those types of behavior patterns. So from the standpoint of what motivates behavior, if it's internally motivated or externally motivated, it may determine what types of behavior has to be accommodated in different types of housing system in order to prevent frustration or suffering, or to maintain proper function in terms of other biological systems. Yeah. In addition to looking at the different factors, like whether it's internal stimuli that control behavior or external stimuli that control behavior, we have to think about most behavior patterns or behavior systems have different phases that are involved in them. And so many behavior patterns, like feeding, for example, has a phase where the animal spends a great deal of time, say, searching, exploring, investigating, seeking out the goal that's the end point for that behavior. And we call this appetitive behavior. Appetitive behavior, so like an appetizer, oftentimes will increase your interest and increase your motivation. So you get an appetizer, it's delicious, it actually increases your motivation to eat. Okay? Appetitive behavior, like the first taste of something, may then lead to more consummatory behavior, which is actually the goal or the end point. So in the sake of feeding behavior, that's pretty obvious what it is. It's ingestion of a feedstuff. Or for the sake of reproductive behavior, it might be copulatory behavior after searching out a mate, which would be the appetitive phase, and so on. And consummatory behavior then occurs when the goal is reached. So Oftentimes, consummatory behaviors also gives a positive feedback. It actually increases motivation. Like that appetizer, which is, you order the appetizer that's appetitive, you get that first couple bites, you start consuming it, and usually feed that tastes good, you start eating more. So it increases your feeding motivation for a while, and then later, after you've eaten a while, it decreases it. Okay, so many behavior patterns. The appetitive behavior is, we've eliminated it for our animals, and we'll see that this is particularly true in feeding behavior and foraging behavior. Animals would spend a great deal of time searching out their food, and it's one area that we have eliminated from their behavioral repertoire. And I've shown feedback mechanisms here that increase or decrease the motivation or the desire, but some of these mechanisms actually feed back into the animal's physiological systems as well. And so the actual performance of the behavior in itself may be important to the animal, and it also may have physiological consequences if they're not allowed to do it. So before I start and get into some of my examples of these different types of behavior systems that are involved like this, we need to ask the question, how different are domesticated animals from their wild ancestors? And so we know that animals' breeding and selection has been controlled for thousands, and in some cases tens of thousands of years. But how much have we actually changed them? And does it influence what they need or what they want, or how we need to house or manage them? And Perry Ensign and his graduate student, Rita Schutz, a few years ago, compared the behavior very directly of the red jungle fowl, which is probably one of our oldest domesticated species, after probably the dog and the goat, to two domesticated breeds of hens. And so they had the red jungle fowl that you see here. Professor Duncan talked about that bird a little while ago, and it's a ground-dwelling species from Asia. And we have shown on the right then our high-line leghorn, who is a highly selected egg-laying machine. She's been selected very intensively for mainly feed conversion. Okay, so she should be not expending a lot of energy, laying a lot of eggs, and is quite different in some ways than her wild ancestor. They compared then the high line and the red jungle fowl on the two ends of the spectrum, and then they also looked at the behavior of Swedish bantams, which is a breed that some would be very much somewhere in between. So bantams, if they're domesticated, they've bred mainly for collections and looks. They're smaller, but they're not the high-powered, high-octane egg-laying machines that we use for table eggs. And they took the birds and reared them, so they had them all from day-olds, reared them in exact identical environments, and then took groups of them and put them in a semi-natural environment and measured what it is that they did, and looked very specifically at how the behavior of the domestic strains had changed compared to the wild jungle fowl. And you can see here's the data for the jungle fowl, the bantam, and the highline on the right. And you can see that there's a few behavior patterns that are a little bit modified, but generally this would be foraging behavior, so the scratching and searching for food, general activities, how busy the animals were. We can see that in the highline bird. She's selected for feed efficiencies. She's a little less active. She's spending more time inactive, so she's saving some energy and being a little more feed efficient. The amount of foraging behavior was significantly and slightly less in the highline, so she's not foraging or searching, going through the searching patterns for her feed as much. However, so there was actually in this natural environment, there was also feed offered to the animals in feeders. But you can see that she still spends a significant amount of her time, close to 30%, engaged in foraging behavior, although she doesn't necessarily need to. What's interesting is that these birds, the highlines compared to the others, spent more time in close proximity of one another, spent less time in affiliative social behaviors, and more time in aggressive social behaviors, which isn't shown here. But all the other behavior patterns that they identified as comfort behavior, like preening, dust bathing, all the other things that birds do to spend their day were exactly identical between the domesticated and the wild ancestor. In terms of, so that was the first experiment that they did in a comparison of what has domestication done to the modern laying hen. They also put the birds through a number of different tests. In this test, they looked at what the intake is of free versus hidden food. So what they did is they put the birds in a test environment, they offered a dish of food, and then they also had food that was hidden in wood shavings. So that the birds, if they wanted to eat the food in the wood shavings, they actually had to go through the pecking and scratching and searching behavior in order to get it. So shown here is the percentage of food that was eaten. So then they were able to weigh it back. Okay. So this is the percentage of food that was eaten by the jungle fowl, the bantam, and the highline hen. And what you see is that the wild birds, even though food was readily available, they could just go over to a feeder and take it out of it, the majority of their food came from this the food that was mixed with wood shavings. They actually chose and ate more that they went to search for, rather than just freeloading out of the feeder of concentrated diet and pellets. Okay? So they're built to spend a great deal of their day foraging. The bantams were similar, and the highlines, you can see, have changed a little bit their foraging behavior. Remember, they've been selected for feed efficiency, large egg laying, so they choose more of the freely available food. However, when you look at that, they're still taking 30% of their food they choose to search for. So that searching behavior seems to be a very important to them to engage in the foraging and the searching parts. Okay, so we've not completely changed them over in terms of their need to forage and search for their food. So if we think and Jensen's work actually, they've gone, for those of you who are into genomics, he calls it behavior genomics, they've actually been using quantitative trait loci to look for the gene differences that are responsible for the behavior in the red jungle fowl versus the highline. And they're thinking that there's actually a few small gene changes that are actually responsible for the differences in these birds. So when we look at the effects of domestication, we get mostly changes in external morphology. So usually we've selected for differences in color or fur or plumage. With that, we get some differences in temperament. And those of you who are familiar with the studies on foxes that were selected for fur color and that came with temperament, we know that. We know that domestication often changes body size and growth patterns and changes in internal morphology. So domesticated species have a tendency for a smaller brain than their wild counterparts and larger intestines, particularly in domesticated livestock, which makes sense because we've turned them into eating machines. We also get some physiological changes in terms of the reproductive cycles and that sort of thing. In terms of behavioral changes, though, the most wild-type behaviors are actually retained in domestic animals. So when we think back about the natural history, it does still actually make sense. And that most of the changes that we see are quantitative rather than qualitative. So those highline birds still prefer to forage for 30% of their intake. Okay? It's lower than the wild jungle fowl, but it still exists. And so and also for some behaviors, thresholds may be altered. And this is particularly true in fear responses and anti-predator responses, where we get reduced fear, increased sociability, and sort of reduced anti-predator responses within domesticated species. So that's the animal that we have to work with now. So where does this all fit into understanding what the importance of normal behavior and welfare, and how we can manage them? There's a number of areas, I think, that we have very significant mismatches between the way we manage the animals and their behavioral biology, and this has some important consequences. And these couple of areas are how we manage mothers and the maternal-young interactions. Okay? Maternal behavior is usually pretty highly motivated. It's an important one, and it hasn't gone away in the process of domestication. The second is how we feed animals. I've just shown you that foraging is retained. The motor patterns, the appetitive components of feeding may be very important to the animal, and there's definitely a mismatch in how we feed animals and also in how we manage our social groupings. So let's start with some of the maternal behaviors in animals that I think there's a mismatch, obviously, between the way that we house them and what their behavioral biology is set up for. Professor Duncan described the nesting behavior of hens. Sows and hens are very similar in many ways. They have the pig world and the hen world and the poultry world, they have a lot in common in terms of the confinement systems in which they've been developed, and show some very analogous situations in terms of what are some of the welfare concerns. Who knew that sows build nests? I know you guys do. So domesticated sows from the European wild boar, but also feral or sows that are just let out in extensive environments will seek out a nest site about 24 hours before the birth of their pig. About 16 or so hours, they begin excavating a shallow depression, get the dirt all cleaned out. Then she goes out and starts gathering material. Peak activity about 9 hours before birth of first piglet, and then she arranges the nesting material in the nest. I don't know if you can see very well. This sow on top, this was actually from an outdoor system in Michigan that I got during graduate school. She was out there in the 80s. Okay? And you can see she's going to give it a little A-frame. And I don't know if you can tell, there's a pile of, she's decided she's not using the A-frame. She's building the nest in front of it. She's carrying a mouthful of straw and putting it, arranging it in a nice huge pile. And sometimes these piles are huge. You can hardly even see the pigs in there. Okay? And then if she were kept in in an outdoor environment, she might engage in very extensive nest building behavior. If she's in a pen with straw, she will go through nest building before birth of the piglet. And you can set your watch to the time nest building starts. It's very, very consistent with regard to the process of parturition. So actually my graduate work, soon after I had to look up heifer in the dictionary, I began studying the role of hormones associated with parturition in nesting behavior. And we know that that nesting behavior emerges at the same time. We get a prolactin increase from that sets the sow up for lactation. Prolactin doesn't seem to be responsible for it, but we know that it's also closely associated with prostaglandin. So prostaglandin F2 alpha. Pig people in here, are you familiar with Ludolice? Hey, Tempo, you were there at the time, no fear. Ludolice is the PGF2 alpha. If you inject it into a sow, she goes into nest building behavior in about 15 minutes. Her head starts going, she starts excavating. She goes through the excavating motions. It just switches on the behavior. Sows in farrowing crates, during the same time period, that 24 hours before birth of the first piglet, you see very similar behavior patterns. And so you'll see, even though she's confined to a farrowing crate, without the amount of space available or the substrate available, she will begin to paw at the floor and root at the floor as if she's excavating her shallow depression. She'll bite at the bars. And then sows who are, so that she's like going the whole gathering, and will spend a great deal of time changing postures up and down. She spends a lot more time in a sitting position rather than lying down before labor or nest building. So it appears that she may be feeling very frustrated at this time. We know, and it's been studied for over 20 some odd years that the hormonal changes associated with parturition stimulate the onset of nest building. And if you think about how important nesting is, piglets are very vulnerable to the cold thermal environment. And it's not the type of behavior that the sow can await for external stimuli from the piglets. That nest has to be ready before they're born. So she has to build that nest at the right time. And so it makes a lot of sense then that those hormonal changes that also start lactation up also switch the behavior on in her head and have her go through the motions. The problem is that when she's in a farrowing crate, she's not able to express that behavior. So we know that performance and completion of nest building, so those hormonal changes switch the behavior on. From studying how the behavior goes to conclusion, it seems that there's a combination of both hormones and then the external stimuli, the straw, and the feedback from the nest that lead to the completion of the behavior and have her settle down. And it appears that restriction appears to be stressful for the sow. Now, sows are a little more difficult to ask if they'll work for a nest because they only farrow about, twice a year, okay? But we do know that it appears to be very stressful for the sow when nest building behavior is restricted. And Susan Jarvis at University of Edinburgh, along with Alistair Lawrence and their colleagues, have done a lot of experiments actually looking at nest building behavior of sows and the stress and whether the stress and the consequences of restricting her behavior at that time. And what you can see here is this is data from 8 sows who were in crates. So these are farrowing crates with no straw and no space for nest building, and sows in pens that had both the space and the nesting material like straw that they were able to use. And what you can see is this is our before farrowing. We see that as parturition approaches, so hours 10, 11, hour 9 is when peak nest building behavior would be happening. We see significantly elevated cortisol levels in the sows who are kept in the crates. And so, and this is peak times in the last, say, 7 to 5 hours before that birth piglet is born. Okay, so sows in pens don't show. Cortisol always goes up during parturition, and there seems to be a more stressful component with being restricted from being able to build the nest. So then they went on, Susan in another study went on to look at, okay, so we've got sows in crates, and other people have seen that there's a lot of behavior differences, and they're pretty consistent between sows that are in crates restricted in space and not having nesting material, and those that are in pens and have the opportunity to pick up straw and build a nest. Well, what is it that's actually very stressful about that? Is it being restricted and not being able to move around during that period, or is it the lack of substrate, or both? And so they looked at sows that were either in crates with no straw or crates with straw. So they isolated the effect of the restricted space, and they compared it with sows in pens with no straw, so no substrate, as well as sows in pens with straw. And what you see here is this is the difference in baseline cortisol compared to when at the time during the period in which several blood samples were taken. And so what you can see is, again, we see this is the last 24 hours before birth of the first piglet. We see again these key times, about 16 to 8 hours, and then about 8 to 4 hours before birth of the first piglet. And the cortisol is significantly elevated in the sows with crates, more so than the sows with between straw and no straw. So from these data, you can see, so on the left, it's the sows who are in crates, regardless of whether they have straw or not, that appear to be have a higher level of stress, and that was significantly different. When we see there's not a significant difference in the sows in pens with either straw or no straw. So during that time, it seems it's actually the restriction of movement that tends to be the most stressful for the sow. So restriction of movement seems to be most important. And there's other evidence that some of the feedback from the nest and feedback from actually being able to perform the behavior has other effects on the sow. There's some evidence that sows who are able to fully engage in nest building have shorter delivery times and lower interbirth intervals. Although this is not consistent in the literature, it's not always being seen. Some studies it is and it's not. There's also some studies that would suggest that sows who are able to fully engage in nest building help the full expression of maternal behavior. And so when those cells are tested with piglet screams or someone picking up their piglets, they tend to get up faster, be more protective, show stronger maternal behavior. So there's this notion that, that being able to perform that behavior actually feeds back to strengthen the maternal behavior at that with that litter. Okay, so that's one way that we treat mothers that may not be the best. There are several ways that we treat young animals, and this is particularly in terms of feeding them, that we know has some important effects on either the performance of abnormal behavior or some of their physiology or physical well-being. And one example is cross-sucking in calves. Now calves are, when all young mammals, are pretty highly motivated to suck. It's that doing the right thing in the right place at the right time thing again. You get spit out in the world, you better suckle that teat. No experience required, because if you don't do it, it's going to be not very probable that you will survive. And so for that, we see that most young mammals, we have really high motivational levels to engage in sucking behavior. But we don't always allow sucking behavior to occur. For example, most veal calves and dairy replacement heifers traditionally have been fed milk from a bucket. Although some are fed with bottles, they're often bucket fed, particularly veal calves. And we know that after they have a milk meal, they tend to develop cross-sucking. So calves in groups will cross-suck on their pen mates. They may be sucking on ears, tails, noses, scrotums, whatever is available, and this can cause injury. But it also is a signal that there's something missing in the sucker's life. Years of research by Anne-Marie DePassy and Jeff Russian, who used to be at Lennoxville in Quebec and who are now at University of British Columbia, they did many, many years of experience looking at what controls sucking in calves. And this is a behavior that's very interesting because you would think that in many ways it would be highly internally motivated, but it's actually for cross-sucking and non-nutritive sucking, it's actually the taste of milk that switches on the behavior. It always occurs after a milk meal is over, and you can take a calf and with a little syringe put some milk or milk replacer on its tongue and it switches on sucking behavior. If it doesn't have somebody around there to suck on, it will suck on fixtures in the pen and so on. They looked at what components were in the milk to switch the behavior on. I think it's the casein that works and not the lactose. And so there's components in the milk that they know is the external stimulus for sucking behavior. Okay? The more concentrated the milk, the more sucking is performed. And sucking motivation wanes about 10 minutes after feeding. They also found that non-nutritive sucking has some physiological implications as well. They gave calves, fed them a milk meal, and then either offered them a dummy teat, a dry teat to suck on for a short period of time, or didn't offer them anything. The calves were cannulated. They looked at jugular values as well as hepatic portal values of some digestive hormones that are involved in digestive physiology, but also act as satiety signals like cholecystokinin. And what you see here is the results. So this is the increase in secretion of insulin, CCK, and gastrin in the hepatic portal vein. And this is 60 minutes after the calves were given a milk meal when they had either a dummy teat in the open bars or no teat in the solid bars. And what you see is that there was significantly higher secretion of those digestive hormones and satiety signals in the calves that were offered teats. So sucking behavior is more than just a vehicle for getting milk into the stomach. It's also an important part of the entire biological system. So we know that the performance of sucking behavior is linked to satiety signals and digestive function in calves. We also know that sucking behavior for babies has a lot of other functions. In human babies, non-nutritive sucking is the most effective pain management that is used. We know that it calms affective state. So babies are upset. It doesn't matter if they're a calf baby. You'll see pig babies are the same way, or a human baby. You stick a soother in its mouth. You don't really solve the problem, but it's fine. So we know that calves have a calming effect by sucking. They also have a reduced heart rate and a lower latency to rest after a milk meal if they've had a dummy teat to suck. That leads me into another animal that, as babies, we don't always feed in the most natural way with potential consequences, and this is piglets. Now, piglets are weaned at, the weaning age for piglets seems to jump around quite a lot. In the natural environment, weaning is a very gradual process. And so everyone's familiar with weaning stress. We've got the psychological parts of it that are associated with maternal bonding, but we also have nutritional stress associated with it as well. Sows and piglets will stay with their moms and nurse for approximately 10 to 17 weeks of age. So this would be a gradual process. They spend fewer and fewer nursings over time. They begin foraging more and more and relying on independent feed. Artificial weaning in pigs in commercial systems has ranges anywhere from back in the 90s. Segregated early weaning and medicated early weaning systems were developed in order to break the disease cycle within pigs. And at that time, pigs were being weaned at about 7 to 14 days of age. Now, at that time, there were a lot of concerns for the welfare of piglets, and so we did quite a lot of research, and we've learned quite a lot about sort of the feeding behavior and that aspect of the behavioral biology of pigs. Conventional weaning is about 3 to 4 weeks. Does anybody know what's the most common weaning age now? What are most people using? Are there any pig people in here? Does anyone know? Yeah. Really early. So late weaning, conventional weaning, non-early weaning is 21 days of age. 21 to 28, okay. So that's late weaning. But if you look at asking the piglet, still compared to 10 to 17, is a bit, quite a bit different still. We know that piglets who were very early weaned, and we still have piglets weaned at 21 and 28 days who suffer some of this, but there's a lot of individual differences. They get a growth check. If they're off feed for a while, it takes them a couple days. They get intestinal damage because of the anorexic period. They tend to drink excessively or drink more water, and they tend to develop oral behavior patterns like belly nosing and navel sucking. Now, we don't see it as much in later weaned piglets, but you do still see it in a number of individual pigs. Now, belly nosing is a rhythmic rubbing of the snout on the midsection of another pig. It develops about 4 to 5 days after weaning and peaks about 2 weeks later. Okay, and it's like clockwork. You see it 5 days, the belly nosing starts after weaning, and then usually 2 weeks later it's gone. It's the motor patterns that are very similar to auto massage, but you tend to get a large variation among piglets. Some piglets never show it, some piglets do it all the time. And in pens where you have a belly nosing and sucking can cause lesions on target pigs. You don't see this as much with later wean, but you do see some of the piglets that are poor doing if they are belly nosers. It appears to be redirected suckling behavior, and again, the suckling is very important. And we know that hungry pigs spend more time massaging the udder. So if you look at pigs on a sow, the ones that are poor doing actually spent more time during massage, just like the belly nosers. Belly nosers spend less time at the feeder and have poorer growth rates. Belly nosing is not a normal behavior. We know most of these behavior problems are definitely affected. Age at weaning is the biggest factor. So the younger the piglet at weaning, the longer it takes to initiate feeding, the less time spent at the feeder during the first few days. The younger the piglet at weaning, the more time it spends at the drinker. Excuse me. And these pigs tend to drink excessively. And this higher level of drinking tends to last even well past the nursery age. And also, the younger the piglet at weaning, the more time they spend belly nosing. Now, we know from rodent studies that the motivational systems or behavioral systems of feeding, drinking, and sucking are very different. There's different control patterns. They develop at different developmental rates, okay, different ages. We also know that they're controlled by very different parts of the brain. And it seems that these centers within the piglet are suffering some confusion, I guess you would say, during the early weaning process. And you can see that from some of the work that we've done that there tends to be just this crossover of feeding and drinking and sucking in the piglet around this age. So one effect is like the veal calf, again we see non-nutritive sucking seems important. And this is work that was done by Jeff Rao in our lab at Guelph, who provided blind teats or nipples so basically gave soothers to piglets. And these were early weaned. I can't remember. I think they were weaned about 14 days of age at this time. And what we see is that providing these teats for non-nutritive sucking, and these were in the bottom of feed troughs. So the piglets had access to those teats, but they were also fed in those troughs as well. Okay, and they were given sort of a liquid gruel feed. You can see that the ones that provided the nipples spent more time at the feeders. They did engage in sucking at those. They spent less time, significantly less time at the drinker, which was interesting. Spent less time belly nosing and less time just sucking and chewing on others. So non-nutritive sucking or giving them a soother tends to eliminate some of the behavior problems by accommodating sucking behavior. But one interesting thing is the fact that these piglets drink excessively, and giving them a soother tended to reduce the amount of drinking, which led us to think, one of my PhD students, Steph Torrey, looked at the effect of drinker design on belly nosing and onset of feeding in piglets. And these are piglets that were weaned at about 18 days of age, so they weren't that early weaned. And we looked at, wanting to ask the question, are piglets drinking to satisfy sucking motivation? Okay, so maybe this nipple drinker, which we call a nipple drinker on the left, okay, maybe the piglets are just at that, trying to satisfy their sucking motivation through that. So we compared the behavior during the first few days after weaning between giving nipple drinkers and bowl drinkers. And the bowl drinkers are these ones at the right. The piglets have to actually push a lever and a little bit of water pools at the bottom of it, and then they have to suck that water out, okay? So what we found that in the first 48 hours after weaning, the style of drinker made a big difference. The nipple drinker pigs used tons more water, 4 times more water than the pigs with the bowl. They spent a lot more time engaged in drinking behavior, and their feed intakes with the nipple drinker were significantly lower. So the bowl drinker changed their behavior quite significantly. It also significantly reduced belly nosing in these pigs. Now we went back to think about, okay, this nipple drinker, we thought they were accommodating sucking behavior, but if you actually look at drinking behavior in ungulates, ungulates have the suck when they drink. So you look at dogs and cats. Dogs and cats are lappers. So dogs and cats take drinks, they lap their water up with their tongues. If you look at an ungulate, they actually make a suction, they roll their tongues around and make a suction and actually suck the water out of a vessel. So it may be that the bowl actually accommodated sucking motivation more than the nipple drinker. Some other work that we did, so I had students working on belly nosing and early weaning for some time, and I had a student, Anita Tucker, who worked with us as well, and we were like, well, when do their teeth erupt? Okay, so when does the onset of feeding behavior occur? And, you know, nutritionists have been working, no offense to any nutritionists in here, but nutritionists have been working on developing diets for pigs, and like high-octane diets with high protein from fish and animal proteins and all of that. And if you ask, so when do pigs get their teeth in? When do they get their molars in so that they can actually have the hardware to process these expensive diets that we're giving weaned piglets? And it turns out that eruption and occlusion of some of the premolars doesn't occur until 18 to 28 days of age. That's a late weaned pig, isn't it? And that occurs, or sometimes even later than that. Now Anita looked at whether the onset of getting their molars in was related to feeding behavior and growth rates. And we didn't find it in a laboratory study, but she actually went to do some studies on commercial farms and looked at, in large numbers of pigs, their premolars number 3 and 4, whether they were erupted and whether they are occluded, and that means whether the teeth come together. And she actually found that the status of tooth eruption at weaning, and these were weaning ages anywhere from 18 to 27 days, was actually related to weight gain in the pigs. Okay, so we've been doing things, so not only the central and behavioral mechanisms, but the pigs don't always even have the hardware to deal with the situation of changing feeding behavior. And we give them creep feed, but if you look at all the studies on creep feeders, most pigs don't touch it until at least after 19 days of age. And in one of Anita's studies, only 60% were eating creep feed at 27 days of age. So what appears is that feeding, drinking, and sucking behavior are in commercial piglets. I mean, these are 3 systems that are developing at different rates at different times, and when feeding behavior is just developing, we're weaning piglets during this kind of critical window of time, and we're seeing confusion among these different motivational systems that are coming up as abnormal behaviors and poor doing pigs and injured pigs because of it. Now, we also make some mistakes in terms of feeding adult animals as well. And I talked about some of the importance of foraging behavior and how in the domesticated hen, although it's lower than in the wild jungle fowl, it hasn't gone away. And in extensive environments, most animals will spend a significant amount of time foraging for their food. Pasture-grazed cows will graze from 8 to 10 hours a day. Gestating sows will spend 12 to 50% of daylight hours rooting outdoors, even if they've been given a diet. And I showed you already that laying hens will spend 30% of their time choosing food that they work for, foraging for, rather than just given to them. And so, in contrast, most livestock and poultry, sorry about that, are fed concentrated diets with very little opportunity for foraging. Some animals are fed restricted diets. Sows, to maintain their body weight. Broiler breeders, the parents of meat birds, have to be severely restricted throughout their lives in order to maintain a healthy body weight. They have very high appetites. You can't let them eat to appetite. So these changes in the way we feed animals, giving little concentrate diets that are, a sow will eat, 20 minutes? And her food for the day is gone. That's it. A lot of these lead to a lot of problems. And this is abnormal behavior, oral stereotypies in ungulates. Cattle tongue rolling. Sows do sham chewing, playing with their drinkers, those sorts of things. Giraffes, which tend to have a lot of oral stereotypies because of the way that they're fed in zoos. We also see things like, because of a lack of foraging and opportunities to peck, things like feather pecking in poultry. Lack of foraging material is a contributor to that. And we see that these stereotypic behaviors, in many cases, are definitely due to or highly influenced by the way the animals are fed, as much so, if not more so, than being kept in a restricted environment. So these are sows at our research station at the University of Guelph. They're in a group housing system. They're fed a drop feeder on the floor. They will eat their feed very quickly, and then after they're fed, they will spend probably, you can see most of the sows there have their head, they don't have any feed left. They have their head down on the floor. They will be spending the time rooting for a significant period of time following feeding. Okay, those sows that are not, I don't know if you can see the two on the left who are relaxing. They've got froth on the sides of their mouth. They're engaging in sham chewing, which is due to a combination of the restricted feeding and also the lack of foraging behavior. So, is natural or normal behavior important for the animals? You bet. We need to think about them for reasons other than, for a lot of different reasons. Many types of natural behavior are motivated by a combination of internal and external stimuli. We need to keep in mind what's going on and what the animal needs to support that behavior. Many are closely linked with other biological processes, and so if the animal doesn't have that feedback, both behaviorally as well as physiologically, it's time for me to stop, there can be consequences in terms of their health, their nutrition, and their welfare. Thanks very much.
Very cool.